If you can play Chopin, I'll marry you my daughter. That's how Richard Whitman, CEO of the prestigious financial consulting firm Meridian Capital, ended his cruel joke in front of 40 executives gathered in the grand hall on the 30th floor. Laughter echoed throughout the room while 32-year-old Daniel Washington stood motionless with his cleaning cart next to the Steinway grand piano that adorned the space. The poisonous comment had been fired when Daniel simply asked permission to clean around the instrument during the company's end-of-year reception. "Look at that, everyone," Richard continued, raising his glass of Dom Perignon champagne. "Our cleaner here is fascinated by the piano. Maybe he thinks he can play something other than rap, right?" Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the floor, but his jaw tightened slightly. There was something in his upright posture, in the way he held the cleaning cloth with his hands revealing curious calluses on his fingertips, that contrasted with the submission everyone expected to see. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitman," Daniel replied in a calm, controlled voice. "I just need to finish cleaning." Richard approached him, clearly drunk with power and alcohol. "No. Now I'm really curious. Do you know who Chopin is, Daniel? Or do you only know those noises you call music?" Richard's daughter, Victoria Whitman, 26, watched the scene from across the room with an uncomfortable expression. A Harvard graduate and the company's marketing director, she had witnessed countless displays of her father's prejudice, but never as explicit as this. Daniel looked up for the first time, meeting Richard's gaze with a serenity that made some of those present shift uncomfortably. "I know Chopin, sir. I know him very well." "Then prove it." Richard slammed his hand down on the piano with excessive force. "If you can play anything that sounds like classical music, I'll personally double your salary. But if you can't," he paused dramatically, "well, maybe it's time to look for a job more suited to your profile." The silence in the room was deafening. 40 pairs of eyes were fixed on Daniel, some with morbid curiosity, others with barely concealed pity. No one dared to intervene. Richard Whitman was known for firing employees for much less. Daniel placed the cleaning cloth carefully on the cart and walked over to the piano. His movements were precise, almost reverent, as if he were approaching a sacred altar he knew intimately. Victoria noticed something the others missed: the way Daniel adjusted the piano bench with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. His fingers tested the keys softly, checking the tuning with the trained ear of a professional. "What piece would you like to hear, Mr. Whitman?" Daniel asked, surprising everyone with the question. Richard laughed loudly. "You choose, genius. I'm sure it will be memorable." At that moment, as Daniel stood before the keyboard, something changed in the air. His relaxed posture, his controlled breathing, the way his hands found the keys without hesitation, all of it revealed a truth that none of those executives could imagine. If you're enjoying this story of how prejudice can blind people to extraordinary talents right in front of them, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what was about to happen in that hall would rewrite not only the night, but the lives of everyone present in a way that Richard Whitman would never forget. Daniel placed his hands on the keys with a delicacy that contrasted brutally with the hostile environment around him. For a moment, the silence in the hall was absolute, 40 executives holding their breath, waiting for the spectacle of humiliation. Then he began to play. It wasn't Chopin. It was a simple, almost childlike melody, "Mary Had a Little Lamb," played with fingers that clearly knew the instrument, but without any technical pretension. The sound echoed through the hall like a confession of mediocrity. Richard burst out laughing. "My God. Mary Had a Little Lamb? Are you serious?" He turned to the guests, gesturing theatrically. "Folks, at least he knows where the keys are." Laughter spread through the room like a contagious virus. Some executives exchanged second-hand looks of embarrassment, but no one dared interrupt the boss's cruel show. "Keep going, keep going," Richard shouted, clapping his hands with exaggerated sarcasm. "Maybe you know Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star too. We can have a children's recital." Daniel maintained his composure, removing his hands from the keyboard with the same serenity with which he had begun. "Sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Whitman. Like I said, I just need to finish cleaning." No. Richard was clearly enjoying himself. "The night is still young. Victoria, come here." He waved to his daughter, who stood motionless on the other side of the room. "Did you hear that? Our janitor here is a real Mozart." Victoria Whitman watched the scene with an increasingly grim expression. A Harvard graduate with honors, marketing director at one of the largest financial consulting firms in the country. She had witnessed her father humiliate employees before, but never so publicly and cruelly. "Father, perhaps it would be better," she began, but Richard cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Better what?" The man asked to play. "I just gave him the opportunity." Richard approached Daniel, deliberately invading his personal space. "You know what the problem is with you people? You always think you deserve more than you're capable of delivering." Daniel continued tidying up his cleaning supplies, but Victoria noticed something the others missed: the way he arranged each item with military precision, as if performing a choreography rehearsed 1,000 times. There was something hypnotic about those controlled movements. "Mr. Whitman," Daniel said, finally looking up, "may I ask you a question?" Richard laughed, clearly intrigued by the audacity. "Of course. Ask away." "Do you really believe that talent has color?" The room fell silent. The question had been asked with disarming calm, but it carried a weight that made some of those present shift uncomfortably in their seats. Richard blinked, momentarily destabilized. What do you mean by that?" "It's a simple question," Daniel continued, his voice maintaining the same respectful but firm tone. "Do you think a person's abilities are limited by their appearance?" The trap was set. Victoria realized it immediately. Any answer her father gave would compromise him publicly. If he said yes, he would expose himself as a racist in front of 40 witnesses. If he said no, he would contradict the humiliation he had just inflicted. Richard, however, was too drunk with power and alcohol to notice the subtlety of the situation. "Look here, young man. I believe in competence. And competence is demonstrated by results, not philosophical questions." "I see," Daniel nodded slowly. "So if someone demonstrated real competence, you would recognize it regardless of other characteristics?" "Of course I would." Richard replied too loudly, vaguely realizing that he was being challenged but unable to back down without losing face in front of his subordinates. Daniel smiled for the first time that night. It was not a submissive or defeated smile. It was the smile of someone who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. "Great. Then maybe we should make a real deal instead of jokes." Richard frowned. "What kind of deal?" "You said that if I could play Chopin, you'd marry me to your daughter. How about we change the terms?" Daniel paused for effect. "If I can play a Chopin piece technically flawlessly, you promote me to the finance department. If I fail, I'll resign tonight." The room went electric. Victoria held her breath. This had escalated beyond cruel prank. It was now a public wager with real consequences. Richard looked around, realizing that every eye was on him. Backing down now would be admitting cowardice in front of his subordinates. Accepting would be, well, it would be giving a janitor a chance to humiliate him publicly. But Daniel was just a janitor. What could go wrong? Deal. Richard extended his hand, sealing the agreement before 40 witnesses. But it has to be real Chopin. No simplified versions. Daniel shook the CEO's hand firmly. "Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. Will that do?" Richard blinked. The technical specificity of the reference caught him off guard, but it was too late to back out. Victoria watched everything with growing fascination and horror. There was something deeply wrong with this situation. Daniel's unshakable confidence, the way he had manipulated his father into making that public bet, the precision with which he quoted the Chopin piece. It was like watching a trap being set in slow motion, but without being able to identify who was really the predator and who was the prey. As Daniel returned to the piano under the skeptical gaze of 40 powerful executives, something began to form in the air, not just tension, but a different energy, as if the room itself were about to witness something that would forever change the way those people understood the world around them. The next 2 hours were the longest of Daniel Washington's life. While Richard Whitman organized a veritable public humiliation ceremony, inviting other executives by text message and asking them to bring cell phones to film the show, Daniel continued his cleaning routine with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural. "Everyone, don't miss this!" Richard shouted across the room, already visibly drunk. "Our cleaner is going to give us a Chopin lesson. Who wants to bet he can read music?" Laughter echoed again, but Victoria Whitman couldn't take her eyes off Daniel. There was something about the way he cleaned the piano, precise, almost reverent movements, as if he knew every curve of the instrument. His hands, which she had initially assumed were just the calloused hands of a manual laborer, revealed a surprising delicacy as he handled the keyboard during cleaning. "Dad, maybe we should stop here," she whispered, approaching Richard. "You've made your joke. The man doesn't deserve any more humiliation." Richard glared at her. "Victoria, dear, you need to understand how the world works. People like him," he said, pointing at Daniel, "need to know their place. I'm doing you a favor." Daniel stopped cleaning and turned slowly. "Mr. Whitman, can I make a quick phone call before our presentation?" "Phone call?" Richard laughed. "Who for?" "Your mother, to tell her you're getting fired today." "An old friend," Daniel replied, keeping his tone respectful. "Someone who can confirm that my technique is still adequate." Victoria frowned. There was something strangely specific about that phrase. Technique is still adequate wasn't the kind of language you'd expect from a janitor talking about playing the piano casually. Richard waved him dismissively. "Make your call. Call whoever you want. The more witnesses to your humiliation, the better." Daniel took a simple cell phone out of his pocket and dialed a number he clearly knew by heart. The call was answered on the second ring. "Professor Martinez?" "It's Daniel." "Yes, Daniel Washington." A pause. "I know it's been a while, but I need a favor. Could you confirm my identity for some people here?" Victoria instinctively moved closer. There was something about the subtle change in Daniel's tone, more confident, more articulate, as if a mask were beginning to slip. Daniel held the phone out to Richard. "He'd like to speak to you." Richard took the phone with a mocking air. "Hello? Who is this?" His expression gradually changed. "Professor from where?" "The Juilliard School." A longer pause. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Richard's face paled visibly. Victoria watched, fascinated, as her father went from arrogant to confused, from confused to worried. "I see. Yes. Thank you." Richard handed the phone back to Daniel, his voice noticeably less confident. "This man said you studied at Juilliard?" Daniel calmly put his cell phone away. "I did. I graduated, actually. Valedictorian, class of 2012. The silence in the room was absolute. 40 executives, who minutes earlier had laughed at the idea of a janitor playing Chopin, were now processing the information that this man was a graduate of the most prestigious music school in the world. That's impossible," Richard stammered. "If you graduated from Juilliard, what are you doing cleaning offices?" Daniel smiled for the first time with genuine amusement. "The same thing you would be doing if you lost everything overnight and had to start from scratch to feed a family." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. There was a story there, a story that explained why a Juilliard-trained pianist was working as a janitor, keeping his true identity a secret. "But why didn't you say anything before?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because," Daniel looked her straight in the eye, "I've learned that people judge first by appearances, and then, if you're lucky, they may become interested in the substance. Tonight was just further confirmation of that." Richard tried to regain control of the situation. "Well, even so, it doesn't mean you can still play. Theory is one thing, practice is another." "You're right," agreed Daniel. "That's why I suggest we modify our bet." "How so?" Daniel walked over to the piano, his movements now charged with an authority he had not shown before. "If I play Nocturne perfectly, in addition to the promotion, you will donate $100,000 to the music program at the public school where my daughter studies." Victoria held her breath. Daniel's confidence had escalated to an almost frightening level. "And if you fail?" Richard asked, trying to maintain some control. "If I fail, not only will I resign, but I will publicly apologize for wasting everyone's time here tonight." The trap had become a real war. Richard looked around, realizing that everyone present was completely absorbed in the situation. To back down now would be to admit cowardice in front of subordinates who would never respect him in the same way again. "Deal," he said, extending his hand again. As Daniel shook the CEO's hand for the second time that night, Victoria noticed something that made her blood run cold. For a split second, when Daniel smiled, she saw not gratitude or nervousness, but something much more complex. It was the smile of someone who had just put all the pieces exactly where he wanted them. At that moment, as Daniel walked to the piano under the tense gaze of 40 witnesses, A question began to form in Victoria's mind. What if all of this, the humiliation, the bet, even working here, was part of a much larger plan? What if Daniel Washington wasn't the victim in this story, but the architect of something none of them could yet comprehend? The answer was just a few notes away. Daniel stood before the Steinway like a general before his army. The silence in the hall was so absolute that you could hear the ticking of Richard's Rolex echoing through the room. 40 executives, who minutes earlier had been laughing like hyenas, now held their breath. His hands touched the first keys of Nocturne in E-flat major with a delicacy that made Victoria shudder. These were not the calloused hands of a janitor exploring an unfamiliar instrument. These were the hands of a master rediscovering a lost love. The melody flowed like liquid silk, each note placed with surgical precision. Daniel wasn't just playing Chopin, he was conversing with the composer across time, interpreting every inflection with an emotional maturity that took decades to develop. Richard Whitman felt his legs go weak. This wasn't just perfect technique, it was pure genius being unveiled before his eyes. Each chord revealed layers of expression that few pianists in the world could achieve. "My God," whispered someone in the audience, "he's extraordinary." Victoria watched her father, seeing him slowly process that he had just publicly humiliated one of the most talented pianists she had ever heard. But there was something else disturbing about Daniel's expression as he played. There was no anger or resentment. There was absolute control. As the piece neared its climax, Daniel did something none of those present expected. He stopped abruptly, rose from the bench, and turned to Richard with a smile that made the CEO's blood run cold. "Mr. Whitman, may I ask you a question before I continue?" Richard, visibly shaken, nodded without speaking. "Do you really believe this company deserves someone of my caliber?" The question echoed through the room like a gunshot. Victoria immediately realized the reversal. Daniel had turned a humiliating audition into an interview where he was the interviewer. Of course I do," Richard stammered, trying to regain some control. Daniel smiled even more broadly. "Great. Then perhaps it's time for a proper introduction." He took an elegant business card from his pocket and held it out to Richard. Daniel Washington, former principal pianist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, financial consultant with a degree from the Wharton School, and as of yesterday afternoon, the new owner of 42% of Meridian Capital. The silence was absolute. Richard took the card with trembling hands, reading and rereading the information as if it were written in hieroglyphics. That's impossible," he whispered. "Actually," Daniel returned to the piano, adjusting the bench with precise movements, "it's quite simple when you have the right resources and the knowledge to identify when a company is vulnerable to a hostile takeover." Victoria felt the world spin around her. You planned all this?" Daniel stared at her with eyes that now shone with razor-sharp intelligence. "Victoria, I spent 6 months working here, observing, learning, documenting every prejudiced comment, every discriminatory decision, every moment this company demonstrated that it prefers privileged mediocrity over genuine talent." He gestured to the hall full of shocked executives. "You didn't even realize that I recorded every cruel word you said about me and other employees. 40 hours of audio that will be very interesting to the Human Resources Department and the media." Richard tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey him. "You can't, this is legal." Daniel laughed. "Perfectly legal. Just as it's legal for an investor to buy shares on the open market and exercise his rights as a majority shareholder." He paused dramatically. "By the way, the special board meeting is scheduled for Monday at 9 in the morning." Reality began to dawn on everyone present. Daniel wasn't just a pianist disguised as a janitor. He was a financial predator who had infiltrated the company to destroy it from the inside out. But why? Victoria asked, genuinely perplexed. "Why do all this?" Daniel returned his hands to the keys, continuing the nocturne exactly where he had left off. As he played, he spoke in a calm, controlled voice. "Because 3 years ago, my wife applied for a position at this company. She was a Harvard graduate, had an MBA in finance, and spoke 4 languages fluently. But she was rejected after a 5-minute interview where Richard here said she didn't fit the company's cultural profile." The notes continued to flow, but now they carried the weight of a devastating truth. She died 2 years ago in a car accident, returning from yet another job interview she had been rejected for. She still had the rejection letter from this company in her pocket. Richard turned completely pale. Victoria covered her mouth with her hands, finally understanding the magnitude of the situation. So yes, Daniel finished the nocturne with such perfection that some of those present cried involuntarily. I planned every second of this evening. And on Monday morning, when I officially take control of this company, my first decision will be a complete audit of all hiring practices over the last 10 years. The last chord echoed through the hall like a final verdict. Daniel stood up, straightened his simple janitor's shirt, and walked over to Richard, who remained paralyzed in his chair. By the way, Mr. Whitman, he said, bowing slightly, about that joke about marrying your daughter. Victoria deserves someone much better than me. Someone who will choose her for who she is, not for a business deal or a cruel bet. As Daniel walked calmly toward the exit, Victoria noticed something that would mark her forever. It wasn't triumph she saw in his eyes, but a deep sadness that the success of his revenge had not been able to completely erase. In the center of that hall where discrimination disguised as tradition had once reigned, a new reality had been born. Like a symphony that finally finds its harmony after years of dissonant notes, proving that true excellence knows no color, social class, or limitations imposed by those who fear genuine greatness. But would it be possible to build bridges over such deep chasms of prejudice and privilege, or were some wounds too deep to heal? 6 months later, Meridian Capital had been completely transformed. What was once a toxic environment of privilege and prejudice now breathed diversity and real meritocracy. Daniel Washington, now officially CEO, had implemented changes that seemed impossible to those who had known the company under Richard Whitman's leadership. 15 new hires this month, Victoria reported during the weekly board meeting, all based solely on technical competence and experience. Our productivity is up 32%. Daniel smiled, leafing through the report. Victoria had become his human resources director after proving that, unlike her father, she genuinely believed in talent regardless of social background or color. Her transformation had been one of the few good things to emerge from that turmoil. And Richard? Asked James Morrison, the new chief financial officer, a former colleague of Daniel's from the symphony orchestra who had abandoned music to pursue a career in finance. Victoria lowered her eyes. He's still suing the company for wrongful termination. But considering the 40 hours of recordings Daniel has of him making discriminatory comments, she paused. The lawyers say he doesn't stand a chance. The truth was harsher than that. Richard Whitman, at 58, had become persona non grata in the financial world. The recordings had been leaked to the media, turning him into the perfect example of how institutionalized prejudice worked in large corporations. No reputable company would hire him again. Daniel had been thorough in his revenge. Every racist comment, every prejudiced joke, every discriminatory decision of the past 2 years had been documented. When it all came to light, Richard's destruction was complete, professional, social, and financial. You know what's ironic? Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the privileged view from the 30th floor. Richard always said that people like me needed to know our place. Turns out my place was right here, in his chair. Victoria laughed, but there was something melancholy in her expression. Sometimes I wonder if you feel any real satisfaction from all this. Daniel looked at her seriously. Do you know what the most satisfying moment in this whole story was? It wasn't seeing your father lose everything. It was last week, when we hired Marina Santos for the legal department. Victoria nodded, remembering. Marina was a black lawyer, a graduate of the same university as Daniel's wife, with an impeccable resume but who had been rejected by dozens of traditional companies. When she walked into her office for the first time and said, "I finally have a chance to show what I'm capable of," I knew that every second of those 6 months of infiltration had been worth it. Meridian Capital was now earning 40% more than it had during Richard's tenure. The change in organizational culture had attracted exceptional talent that had previously been systematically excluded by prejudices disguised as cultural fit. Daniel had created a scholarship program for low-income young musicians, funded entirely by the company's additional profits. Ironically, Richard's prejudices were now funding opportunities for the very people he despised. "There's something I've always wanted to ask you," Victoria said, gathering her courage. "Did you really plan everything from day one?" Daniel smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Victoria, I didn't want to do any of this. All I wanted was for my wife to have had a real chance. When she died with that rejection letter in her pocket, something died in me too." He stood up and walked over to the piano he had installed in his office, the same Steinway where it had all begun. Revenge didn't bring her back. It didn't take away the pain. But at least it ensured that other people like her won't have to go through the same thing. Victoria watched as Daniel gently played the first chords of Chopin's Nocturne, the same piece that had revealed his true identity on that fateful night. "You know my father is ruined, right?" she said, breaking the musical silence. "I know." Daniel continued playing. "And you know he did this to himself, right?" Victoria nodded. It was painful, but true. Richard had created every situation that led to his own downfall. At that moment, watching Daniel play with the same devastating perfection that had silenced an entire room of arrogant executives, Victoria understood something fundamental about justice. It wasn't about destroying enemies, it was about building something better on the rubble of what was rotten. The last chord echoed through the office like a final period. Daniel turned to Victoria with a genuine smile for the first time in months. "You know what the best part of this whole story is? I finally understood what my wife was trying to teach me. She used to say that talent without opportunity is like music without an audience, wasted. Now, every time I see Marina shining in the legal department, or James bringing his musical experience to innovate in finance, I hear that song playing." Meridian Capital had become more than a successful company. It had become living proof that true excellence knows no color, social class, or background. It just needs the right opportunity to flourish. Richard Whitman tried to humiliate Daniel to show him his place. He ended up discovering that Daniel's place was exactly where genuine talent should always be, at the top, leading by example and building bridges where others built walls. The best revenge wasn't destroying those who underestimated him. It was turning pain into purpose, prejudice into opportunity, and proving that when you combine real talent with unwavering determination, there's no ceiling that can hold you back. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true victory is not in taking down your enemies, but in building something so extraordinary that any attempt to diminish it becomes irrelevant.